The call arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was inside our Savannah firm's basement archives, reviewing historical drawings, when my father phoned to cleanly erase me from our upcoming centenary gala brochure and foundational bronze plaque. Addressing me as Sarah, the corporate name, he imposed to simplify his public identity. He explained that my stepmother required a streamlined lineage featuring only her children, Nicholas and Olivia, to secure New York heritage funds. I accepted the extraction with absolute stillness, knowing my father's load bearing columns were already splitting from the weight of his compromise. When a family system demands that you step into the shadows to keep their public image pristine, do you think that is mere social calculation or an explicit execution of cruelty? Would you have stayed silent to preserve the peace, or would you have waited to see what happens when the foundation shifts? The click of the disconnected line was exceptionally clean. It hung in the damp, climate-controlled air of the repository, a small acoustic event that signaled my formal liquidation from the family narrative. I did not put down my drafting pencil. My fingers remained steady against the cold steel casing as I finished tracing the structural alignments of a 1920s brick cotton exchange. From the floors above, the muffled, syncopated clinking of catering silver drifted down through the ventilation shafts. It was the sound of a family preparing to toast their own immaculate lineage, completely relieved that the low-maintenance daughter had once again chosen not to make a scene. I knew that tone my father used intimately. When an old money legacy family consistently tells you how reasonable you are, it is not a recognition of your character, it is an acknowledgement of your utility. They call you low maintenance because your predictability makes their convenience profitable. For 4 years, since the month my mother died, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing an emotional bill that they had systematically overdrawn. While my step-siblings, Nicholas and Olivia, managed the press releases and accepted executive equity shares in tailored suits, I had been the invisible mechanism holding up the architecture of the Manning Group. I spent weeks at a time in mud-crusted field boots checking timber foundation columns while they branded the results. That is when I realized some things don't break all at once. They rot quietly behind the drywall, covered by fresh coats of premium paint, until a single structural shift brings the ceiling down. My father truly believed my quietness was a submission. He mistook my baseline patience for a structural weakness, entirely unaware that my compliance was not a white flag. It was a diagnostic protocol. In my profession, you do not attempt to stabilize a settling historic facade by shouting at the shifting masonry. You step back with a laser level and a plumb line, and you map the exact trajectory of the failure. I opened a secure drawer beneath the flat files and reached for a heavy, unpolished iron key, the exclusive marker to my mother's private asset vault at Sterling Title and Trust. My father didn't know the vault existed. He was too consumed with the aesthetic surface of his new life to notice the absolute ownership documents missing from his corporate safe. I methodically closed the county land registry map on my screen, logged out of the central architecture database, and typed a single 3-word directive to my legal proxy, Jennifer Chin. Execute encumbrance filings. The immediate automated confirmation blinked back in the darkness of the lower vault, a small green pulse that initiated a silent legal freeze. They wanted a flawless, unencumbered pedigree for the New York investment funds at the Telfair Academy Gala, but they had left their entire operational infrastructure unprotected. I stood up, locked the archival casing, and walked out into the damp Savannah twilight, leaving the envelope from yesterday's lunch with the unsigned quitclaim deed resting precisely at the center of my desk. True lineage leaves a footprint in the masonry. To understand the corporate architecture of the Manning Group's current crisis, you have to look closely at what my father, Jeffrey, chose to systematically ignore after my mother passed away. He had always been the celebrated public face of the firm, the charismatic preservationist who could convince Savannah's most rigid historic boards to approve modern variances by sheer force of old money charm. But my mother had been the structural engineer who actually kept those ancient brick buildings from sliding into the salt marsh. She was an uncredited partner who spent 30 years quietly acquiring real estate easements and intellectual design copyrights under a private, non-corporate estate trust, knowing that Jeffrey viewed capital as a fluid resource meant for social display rather than long-term stability. Only later did I understand what that moment really meant for my own boundaries. What stayed with me wasn't the argument, it was the silence after. At the time, I assumed my patience was an active investment in the survival of the business, but I was simply being trained to occupy the structural spaces they found inconvenient. True wealth is structural. It belongs to the person who holds the foundational title deeds, not the ones who rent the ballroom for a single weekend to display their vanity. Yet, I quietly abided by their ledger. I watched from the lower vault as Susan spent her first year redecorating our corporate offices in imported marble and polished brass, treating our history like a temporary furniture showroom. Her children, Nicholas and Olivia, were immediately handed executive equity shares and premium branding roles for presenting simple marketing slide decks to country club associates, while I remained the designated field archivist, earning a modest salary that kept me classified as low risk, predictable, and entirely dispensable. Your father cannot stand an empty room, Autumn, my mother had told me during our final weeks in the old house on Monterey Square. And when he finds someone to fill that space, he will spend everything to maintain an image of success that he hasn't earned. Protect the foundations, honey. Never let them see the legal deeds. I had honored that final directive down to the exact millimeter. Facing the daily reality of my assignments, I wore unbranded utility clothes amidst the sea of designer patterns, blending into the structural background of our projects while recording the true parameters of our holdings. They mistakenly assumed my lack of corporate visibility was an absolute design failure. Logan, my brother, had chosen the path of least resistance, signing off on structurally compromised luxury loft conversions across the historic district just to avoid Susan's cold disapproval at our mandatory Sunday dinners. But during those 4 years of isolation, I had been systematically cataloging every title deed and historic preservation easement my mother had left behind. I knew the structural integrity of every column in our portfolio. I knew which brick warehouses were legally bound by ancestral land covenants, and more importantly, I knew exactly which multi-million-dollar commercial projects my father was currently marketing to New York developers without holding the foundational land rights to support them. The prelude to that phone call had actually unfolded the day prior. Our Monday veranda lunch had been executed with clinical social politeness. The linen was a blinding, immaculate white under the midday Georgia sun, and the silver ice tongs made a rhythmic, hollow clicking against the crystal glasses as Susan systematically laid out their corporate strategy. Her children, Nicholas and Olivia, sat flanking my father, their modern, tailored suits looking perfectly suited for a luxury lifestyle magazine cover. They had already arranged the layout for the centenary brochure, and my name had been cleanly replaced with a paragraph celebrating Nicholas's new commercial interior design credentials. "It's about operational alignment, Sarah," Susan said, using the commercial name my father gave me, her voice dropping into that smooth, persuasive public relations cadence she reserved for difficult clients. "The New York investment funds we are partnering with for the new luxury eco-resort expect a specific, cohesive face for the Manning legacy. Your father's history needs to look progressive, modern, and unencumbered by old-fashioned technical disputes. We're simply protecting your time, dear. You belong in the field, not under the corporate spotlight where image defines the equity." My father didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on his wine glass, nodding in rhythmic agreement with his wife's marketing vocabulary. There is a distinct pathology in modern systems. People frequently mistake the marketing of an asset for the actual structural ownership of the land beneath it. My stepmother, Susan, understood fonts, letterpress invitations, and the curated genealogy of a country club guest list. She understood how to sell the look of ancestral prestige to Savannah's historic boards. What she and my father forgot is that a brand is just a coat of paint on a building. If the structural columns beneath the floorboards are rotted out, or if the actual title to the land beneath your feet is held by the person you left sitting in the hallway, the gold letters on the plaque don't matter. They had built a centenary anniversary celebration on top of a legal sinkhole, purely because they preferred the color of the grass on the modern digital rendering. Then, Jeffrey slid a heavy cream envelope across the white linen. The bank's underwriters just flagged a minor clerical anomaly from 1984 on the Oatland Creek parcel. "Sarah," he said smoothly, "it's just a routine administrative cleanup. a standard quitclaim deed to remove your name from the historic marshland title so they can release the infrastructure loan before the gala this weekend. It's a mere formality. Logan's already signed his portion. I looked at the document, observing the subtle, tense expansion of Nicholas's shoulders. He was the one slated to lead the commercial development of that pristine marshland. They had spent 2 years designing a $30 million resort without ever performing a forensic title check on the ground they intended to pave over. I didn't sign. I merely slipped the envelope into my bag, stood up, and left them with the polite nod that they mistook for ultimate submission. The real-world consequences of my Tuesday directive materialized the very next morning. Around that mahogany table, my father, Susan, and their commercial developers sat insulated by the glossy, multi-million-dollar renderings of the Oatland Creek Luxury Eco Resort. They had called this mandatory meeting to leverage my compliance on the quitclaim deed, entirely oblivious to the fact that Jennifer Chin had already laid the county deed registries from 1984 directly before their primary underwriters. "Sarah, listen to me," my father said, his voice carrying a raw, unyielding edge of corporate authority through the speaker. "The underwriters have suddenly frozen our infrastructure line of credit because of an old title cloud on the Oatland parcel. Your refusal to execute that standard deed is generating an artificial panic among our New York backers. This is a $30 million development that secures the next 20 years of this firm's legacy, and Nicholas and Olivia have their entire corporate reputations attached to this launch. My name is Autumn Jeffrey," I said, my voice cutting through the speaker static with absolute clinical finality. "And your $30 million development is sitting entirely on my mother's ground. What stayed with me wasn't the weight of my own name, but the immediate, heavy paralysis that dropped over the line. I let the silence settle into their pristine corporate space before allowing Jennifer to outline the forensic mechanics of their failure. The title cloud their underwriters had flagged wasn't an administrative error. It was an absolute, non-severable environmental and architectural preservation easement established 40 years ago by my mother's family estate. It legally prohibited any modern foundation, pouring, commercial paving, or structural modification of the wetlands on that specific parcel. The family's multi-million-dollar vulnerability was completely real, born from their own short-sighted arrogance. Because of an ancient 1984 indexing error in the Chatham County record system, the restrictive land covenants had remained hidden from their preliminary digital scans. They had simply cut corners, assuming the land was clear. It wasn't until the New York underwriters demanded a deep manual title search just days before the gala that the red flags finally surfaced. Panicking, my father had hastily arranged that veranda lunch to slip a quitclaim deed past me, desperately trying to mask a catastrophic title defect as a routine administrative cleanup. He assumed his low-maintenance daughter was too compliant to understand she held the absolute key to the ground beneath their feet. Some protections are designed decades before the threat even materializes, hidden quietly in old parchment until the system tries to exploit the ground. The sole direct trustee of that protective trust wasn't the Manning Group, it was me. The high-end rendering boards propped against the boardroom walls suddenly looked like nothing more than expensive cardstock in a failing house of cards. The formal legal warfare began at precisely 8 a.m. the following morning. I walked past the manicured moss of Wright Square and entered the unvarnished legal offices on Bull Street, shifting the battlefield entirely, from emotional domestic spaces to clinical, documented mechanisms. Jennifer Chin, my old college roommate, and the retained legal counsel for my late mother's estate trust didn't rely on modern digital threats. She utilized formal, certified county filings. The Manning Group's massive commercial expansion relied entirely on cross-collateralizing an old money preservation endowment worth $8,200,000, a historic trust established by my maternal grandfather that my father had illegally pledged against his modern construction loans, assuming his low-maintenance daughter would never check the original covenant terms. By noon, Jennifer had filed a formal notice of fiduciary breach and asset freeze directly with the firm's principal lenders. She legally flagged a major structural misalignment between the endowment's original preservation mandates and Susan's new commercial luxury developments, forcing the bank's compliance systems to immediately freeze all of their remaining operational accounts. The response from the Manning Group was immediate and aggressive. Their senior corporate attorneys didn't simply panic, they filed an immediate emergency injunction to block our disclosure, threatening to lock our trust funds in a prolonged, multi year discovery court battle that would freeze my own personal equity. This was the exact real world friction my mother had warned me about, the expensive, exhausting, stalling tactics of an empire trying to protect its facade. When you shift the conflict from emotional arguments to documented legal structures, you stop fighting their arrogance and start letting their own overhead dismantle them. I knew my father's cash reserves down to the last decimal point. His commercial overhead was massive. He had pre-committed millions to construction contracts for the eco resort that required immediate credit releases to avoid catastrophic default penalties. He could not afford a 3-month discovery delay, even if his lawyers claimed they could tie me up in court indefinitely. The room felt they are trying to outspend us on retainers. Autumn, Jennifer told me over our secure line as the corporate counterfilings piled up on her desk. They genuinely believe you'll cave because the Centenary Gala is in less than 48 hours and the local papers are already printing the grand layout of the guest list. Susan has already confirmed the floral deliveries. I told Jennifer to reject their preliminary settlement offer, decline the emergency mediation, and let the discovery clock run its course. 10 minutes later, my personal phone began to vibrate against the wooden surface of my private studio drafting table. It was Logan, his voice cracking with structural panic from the office floorboards. The power shift didn't manifest as an overnight corporate execution. It unfolded over 3 weeks of grueling, silent administrative gridlock. A 72-hour bureaucratic delay at the Chatham County Land Registry stalled our formal easement enforcement, leaving the entire project in a tense legal limbo where neither side could make an operational move. I didn't return to the office, nor did I block my father's personal number. I simply allowed the real-world consequences of their overhead to perform the heavy labor. The Centenary Gala at the Telfair Academy went forward, but the narrative Susan had spent 18 months designing had completely collapsed. The New York Heritage Funds had quietly suspended their attendance pending clear title verification, and the local news layout didn't feature a flawless blended family legacy. It contained columns questioning the structural solvency of Savannah's oldest firm. High society board members began quietly returning their gala invitations, choosing social distance over public association with the historic title scandal. My brother Logan spent his days fielding calls from frantic contractors, while Nicholas and Olivia's modern marketing accounts went completely silent. At midnight on the 3rd week, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my father standing on the unvarnished wooden porch of my historic restoration workshop, his tailored overcoat looking strangely out of place against the raw timber frames. He looked noticeably thinner, his charismatic country club composure completely stripped away by 30 days of financial credit freezes. "She's leaving. Autumn," he said quietly, using my real name for the first time in years, his voice barely carrying over the wind from the square. "Susan's moving her things back to New York. Her children are frantically resigning from the board because they foolishly signed personal guarantees for the eco resort, and their private assets are now directly exposed to the default. You've destroyed this firm's centenary. Was your revenge worth all this dust?" I looked at him, feeling no anger, no satisfaction, only the clean, clinical detachment of a preservationist inspecting a building that had been built on sand. "You chose a woman you've known for 5 years over the daughter who has maintained your structural foundations for 28, I said softly. "You chose the narrative, Jeffrey. Now you have to live within its actual boundaries." I didn't destroy anything. I just stopped supporting the weight. The final corporate reorganization of the Manning Group was executed not in a crowded courtroom, but in a quiet, wood-paneled conference room on Monterey Square, finalized by the dry, rhythmic scratching of legal fountain pens. There were no dramatic speeches or tearful apologies. My father sat at the end of the table, his signature shaky but compliant as he signed the formal restructuring documents prepared by Jennifer Chin. The terms were absolute and non-negotiable: the immediate transfer of a 51% controlling equity stake in the Manning Group to my mother's trust, absolute physical control over the firm's ancestral archive vault, a permanent voting board seat, and full veto power over all future historic zone commercial conversions. Susan's children were cleanly removed from the operational registry, their corporate branding titles dissolved by the reality of historic property law. Nicholas and Olivia returned to standard commercial brokerage positions in New York, their modern lifestyle narrative completely dismantled by the structural integrity of county land covenants. Logan remained as the chief structural engineer, but under an operational matrix where his safety calculations were reported directly to my board seat, shielding him from the family pressure that had once compromised his integrity. My father and I have coffee once a month at a quiet table in Madison Square. The conversation is always stilted, measured, and carefully limited to municipal building codes, architectural permits, and the structural preservation of Savannah's foundations. The easy, unthinking relationship we had before my mother's death is gone, replaced by a cold, mutual respect that has been carved out of financial necessity. He has stopped looking at me as his low maintenance daughter, and I have stopped expecting him to be a father capable of looking past his own reflection. Real legacy isn't something you display on a polished bronze plaque to secure social validation. It is the unmovable ground you choose to preserve when the temporary structures turn to dust. Mom taught me that true wealth is quiet. It never requires you to render your identity invisible just to simplify someone else's narrative. Genuine family shows up. They don't let you fade into the background while they plan their grand celebrations. I simply return their lessons wrapped in a legal easement they couldn't break and a truth they couldn't escape. And I moved forward into a future that was wholly my own, building a life full of people who actually showed up, who actually cared. Sometimes revenge isn't about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It is simply refusing to play by rules designed to keep you small. Sometimes it's choosing yourself over people who never chose you. I'd spent 28 years trying to earn my family's love, and it took losing them completely to realize I'd never needed it in the first place. And honestly, I've never been happier. Have you ever experienced a situation where your boundaries were treated as an inconvenience to someone else's image? How did you find the courage to hold your ground when the pressure to comply was at its highest? I would value hearing your perspective, your life lessons, and your personal stories in the comments below.